The morning light filtered through my kitchen window, casting familiar shadows across the oak table where Margaret and I used to share our coffee. 73 years old, and I still set out 2 cups before catching myself. Old habits die harder than the people who made them worth keeping. The package arrived with the mail, no fanfare, just Eddie dropping it on my porch with his usual grunt. Brown paper wrapping, my name written in careful block letters that made my chest tighten. I knew that handwriting, had seen it evolve from crayon scribbles to homework assignments to wedding invitations. David's hand, though it had been 3 years since I'd seen anything from him that wasn't typed. Inside was a bottle of Macallan 25-year-old single malt, the kind of whiskey that costs more than some people make in a month. The label caught the morning light like amber, and for a moment, I could almost hear Margaret's voice. Well, isn't that something special? She always said that about gifts, whether they cost $5 or $500. Tucked beneath the bottle was a cream-colored card with embossed edges. The kind Margaret would have approved of, proper paper, the weight that speaks of consideration. But the message inside was spare, almost formal. Dad, happy 73rd birthday. Join us for dinner Saturday at 7. Catherine has something wonderful planned, David. No love before his name. No hope you're doing well. Just the facts, delivered with the efficiency of a business invitation. I read it twice, looking for warmth between the lines. But David had always been economical with words when he didn't want to reveal too much. Catherine, my daughter-in-law of 12 years, though she'd never quite warmed to being called anything but Catherine. Not Katie, not even Kat. She had corrected me gently but firmly at their wedding reception. It's Catherine, please, Mr. Hartwell, as if the extra syllables created necessary distance. I set the card beside the bottle and studied them together. The whiskey was beautiful, museum-quality beautiful. The invitation was polite, professional, the kind you would send to a business associate you're obliged to include, but don't particularly want to engage. Don't read too much into it, I told myself. It's been a difficult few years for all of us. But sitting there in my empty kitchen, I couldn't shake the feeling that this birthday gift was less celebration and more obligation. Margaret's photograph smiled at me from the mantelpiece, the one where she's wearing her blue dress with the small flowers, taken at our 42nd anniversary dinner, just 8 months before the stroke took her voice, then her mobility, then everything else. In the photo, her eyes hold that mischievous spark she got when she knew something I didn't. What would you make of this, sweetheart? I asked the silence. I could almost hear her answer. You go, Thomas. Family is family, even when it doesn't feel like it. The bottle of Macallan sat on my counter like an expensive question mark. I hadn't touched alcohol since my heart attack 2 years ago. Doctor's orders, reinforced by the daily pills that rattled in their amber containers like small reminders of mortality. David knew this. He'd been at the hospital when Dr. Martinez had explained the new dietary restrictions, the lifestyle changes that would keep me around longer. So, why whiskey? The question followed me as I went about my morning routine. Coffee, oatmeal, checking the locks on the workshop. Margaret used to say I was like a ship's captain, always inspecting the rigging. You'd check the hinges on Heaven's Gate, she'd tease, and I'd tell her someone had to make sure things stayed where they belonged. By noon, I'd read David's invitation 6 times. Each reading left me with the same hollow feeling, like biting into an apple and finding it mealy at the core. There was something perfunctory about it, something that reminded me of the Christmas cards we'd received the past few years. Always signed David and Catherine, never love. Always arriving exactly on time, never early with excitement or late with apology. I tried to remember the last time I'd heard genuine warmth in my son's voice. The last time he'd called just to talk, not to update me on Catherine's promotion or their latest home renovation. The last time he'd asked about me, not my health, not my house, not my finances, but me, how I was sleeping, what I was reading, whether I missed his mother as much at breakfast as I did at dinner. The answer settled in my chest like a stone. I couldn't remember. But he was still my son. The boy who'd helped me rebuild the back deck the summer he turned 16, who'd held Margaret's hand at her bedside while I signed papers I barely understood, who'd stood with me at her graveside while the preacher said words that felt too small for 45 years of marriage. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to hear how this story resonates with fathers and families around the world. I picked up the bottle again, feeling its weight. Whatever David's motivations, whatever distance had grown between us, this was still my son extending an invitation. And Margaret, God rest her soul, would never forgive me for refusing it out of pride. Saturday evening found me standing before my closet, holding the navy blazer Margaret had bought me for David's sitting. "You need something distinguished," she'd said, smoothing the lapels with those careful hands. "Something that says you're proud to be his father." I was proud. Had been proud. The question that haunted me now was whether pride could survive what felt like slow, steady erosion. The drive to David's house took 30 minutes through suburbs that grew more manicured with each mile. When I'd first visited their home 5 years ago, Margaret had whispered, "Goodness, Thomas, look at the size of that driveway." She wasn't being critical, Margaret never was, but there was wonder in her voice. Wonder at how far our boy had come from the 3-bedroom ranch where he'd grown up, where the biggest luxury was central air conditioning and a garbage disposal. David's house sprawled across what had once been farmland, all clean lines and large windows that probably cost more to replace than I'd spent on my first car. The driveway could have hosted a wedding reception. Everything about it spoke of success, achievement, arrival. I parked my 15-year-old Honda beside Catherine's pristine BMW, conscious of the rust spot near my rear wheel well and the duct tape holding my passenger mirror in place. Small indignities, but they felt larger in this setting. The front door opened before I could knock. Catherine stood there in a black dress that probably had a designer's name I wouldn't recognize, her blonde hair styled in a way that looked effortless, but surely wasn't. She smiled the same smile she'd given me for 12 years, polite, pleasant, and completely devoid of genuine warmth. Thomas, right on time. She leaned forward for a brief hug that involved no actual contact, just the motion of intimacy without the substance. David's in the kitchen, putting the finishing touches on dinner. I followed her through rooms that looked like magazine spreads, each space perfectly appointed, everything in its place. No newspapers folded and refolded on side tables, no reading glasses forgotten on coffee tables, no comfortable clutter that spoke of actual living. It felt like walking through a museum exhibit. How successful people live, circa 2024. David appeared from what I assumed was the kitchen, wearing an apron over his dress shirt. My son at 45 was still handsome, though his face had acquired the subtle tension that comes with responsibility and worry. He'd inherited Margaret's eyes, but my stubborn jaw, and seeing that familiar combination in an unfamiliar expression was like looking at a photograph that had been slightly overexposed. Dad. He embraced me, a genuine hug that lasted just long enough to convince us both it was real. "Thanks for coming. Hope you didn't have any trouble finding us." I'd been to his house a dozen times, but I didn't point that out. No trouble at all. The kitchen was the size of my entire downstairs, all granite and stainless steel. Everything looked expensive and rarely used, like a showroom rather than a place where families gathered for morning coffee or late-night snacks. "I made your favorite," David said, checking something in an oven that probably cost more than my monthly pension. "Pot roast with potatoes and carrots, just like Mom used to make." The lie hit me harder than it should have. Margaret's pot roast had been good, honest food cooked in a slow cooker that had seen 20 years of service. It came with burned edges and overcooked carrots and the kind of gravy that was equal parts flour and love. This, whatever was in that pristine oven, might taste similar, but it wouldn't be the same. "That's very thoughtful," I said, because it was easier than explaining why thoughtfulness and authenticity weren't always the same thing. Catherine appeared at David's shoulder, close enough to suggest unity. "We thought it would be nice to have something familiar, something that would remind you of better times. Better times. As if my current life was somehow a pale shadow of what came before. As if being 73 and widowed was automatically worse than being younger and married, rather than simply different." The comment stung, partly because it was delivered with such casual certainty, but mostly because there was a grain of truth in it that I wasn't ready to examine. We moved to the dining room, where the table was set with china I didn't recognize, and cloth napkins folded into perfect triangles. Everything was lovely, expensive, and formal. Nothing like the kitchen table gatherings where David had grown up, where we ate off everyday plates and used paper napkins and talked about everything and nothing while the evening news played in the background. As we sat down, I noticed an extra place setting. "Are we expecting someone else?" I asked. David and Catherine exchanged a look. Quick, but not quick enough to hide the communication that passed between them. Catherine's parents are joining us, David said, cutting his meat with more attention than it required. Hope that's okay. They're eager to see you again. I hadn't seen Catherine's parents, Gerald and Patricia Morrison, since David's wedding. They lived in Florida now, something to do with golf and favorable tax situations. Nice enough people, though I'd always gotten the impression they found me slightly quaint. A man who had worked with his hands for 40 years, who'd never seen the inside of a country club, who read paperbacks instead of hardcovers and bought his clothes from department stores rather than boutiques. The doorbell chimed with a melody I didn't recognize. Nothing so common as a simple bell, but something that probably had a name and a price point. "That'll be them," Catherine said, her voice brightening in a way it hadn't when greeting me. Gerald and Patricia Morrison entered like they were making an entrance rather than simply arriving. Gerald had the kind of tan that spoke of leisure time and adequate health insurance. Patricia wore pearls and the expression of someone accustomed to being the most interesting person in any room. "Thomas!" Gerald gripped my hand with the aggressive firmness of a man who had read that handshakes revealed character. Good to see you. Good to see you. How are you holding up?" Holding up. Another casual phrase that reduced my life to mere endurance rather than living. I was beginning to notice how often people spoke to me as if I were recovering from something rather than simply continuing. "I'm doing well, thank you." Patricia offered her cheek for a kiss that was more performance than affection. "You look wonderful, Thomas. Retirement suits you." I'd been retired for 8 years. She'd said the same thing at David's wedding. We returned to the dining room, where the extra chairs suddenly made sense. This wasn't an intimate birthday dinner between father and son. This was something else, though I couldn't yet name what. The conversation over dinner was pleasant, safe, and utterly predictable. Gerald talked about his golf handicap and the challenges of finding good help for their Florida home. Patricia discussed their recent cruise and the disappointing quality of shipboard entertainment. Catherine mentioned her work with a charity that helped provide art supplies to underprivileged children. Worthy work, delivered with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested it was meant to impress rather than engage. David said little, which wasn't unusual. He'd always been quieter in groups, more observer than participant. But tonight his silence felt different, charged with something I couldn't identify. The pot roast was excellent, professionally prepared in a way that Margaret's never would have been. It tasted like success and careful planning. It didn't taste like home. As Catherine cleared the dinner plates, Gerald leaned back in his chair with the satisfied air of a man approaching his favorite part of the evening. "Thomas," he said, swirling wine in a glass that probably had a pedigree, "David tells us you're rattling around in that big old house all by yourself." There it was, the reason for the whiskey, the formal invitation, the extra place settings. I'd been wondering when we'd get to the point of this gathering. "It's not that big," I said carefully. 3 bedrooms, manageable, but so many memories," Patricia added with the kind of sympathetic tone usually reserved for terminal diagnoses. "It must be difficult being surrounded by reminders." Margaret's presence wasn't a reminder. She wasn't a memory to be managed or a ghost to be exorcised. She was simply part of who I was, woven so completely into my daily life, that removing her would be like trying to take the blue out of sky. "The memories are good ones," I said. David finally spoke, his voice careful, practiced. "Dad, we've been thinking. That house is a lot for one person to maintain. The yard work, the repairs, the property taxes. I'd maintained that house for 30 years. Had built the deck with my own hands, planted the oak tree in the front yard when David was 10, rewired the basement workshop when we decided to add power tools. Every inch of that property bore my fingerprints, my sweat, my care. I manage fine." "Of course you do," Catherine said, returning with coffee service that looked like it belonged in a hotel. "But wouldn't it be nice not to have more time for yourself?" More time for what? I wanted to ask. I had plenty of time. Time to read the morning paper cover to cover, time to tend Margaret's garden, time to work on small projects in my shop, time to remember and time to grieve, and time to figure out what the rest of my life might look like. "There are wonderful communities now," Patricia continued, apparently encouraged by my silence. "Active adult living, they call it. Golf courses, social activities, people your own age. People your own age, as if I were some exotic animal that could only thrive in a carefully controlled habitat with others of my species." Gerald leaned forward, adopting the tone men use when they're about to offer you something they're certain you need. The thing is, Thomas, David and Catherine have been looking at some properties, investment opportunities. Your place sits on valuable land. And there it was, delivered with the casual efficiency of a business proposition. My home, the place where I'd raised my son and buried my wife, reduced to square footage and market value. I see, I said, though I was only beginning to see the scope of what they'd planned. David wouldn't meet my eyes. It's not about the money, Dad. It's about what makes sense for everyone. The coffee in my cup had gone cold, but I took a sip anyway, buying time to process what I was hearing. This wasn't a family birthday dinner. This was an intervention, carefully choreographed and performed with the kind of polite ruthlessness that reminded me why I'd never been comfortable in rooms like this. They sat around me with their concerned expressions and their reasonable voices, explaining why my life needed to be reorganized for my own good. Why the home I'd shared with Margaret, the workshop where I'd built David's first treehouse, the garden where she'd planted roses that still bloomed each spring. Why all of this was somehow too much for me to handle. But what struck me most wasn't their presumption or their poorly concealed avarice. It was David's silence, the way he let his wife and in-laws do the talking while he studied his coffee cup, as if it contained answers to questions he was afraid to ask. This was my son, the boy who had cried when his hamster died, who'd called me at 2 a.m. during his freshman year of college because he was homesick, who'd asked me to teach him to tie a proper knot before his first camping trip. Now he sat across from me, unable to look me in the eye, while strangers dismantled my life with spreadsheet efficiency. The whiskey made sense now, not a gift, but a gesture toward the past, one last acknowledgement of who I used to be before they helped me become who they thought I should be. I set down my coffee cup with the kind of deliberate care that draws attention without demanding it. "This has been lovely," I said, standing. "Thank you for dinner and for the clarity." David looked up sharply. "Dad, we're not trying to—" "I know exactly what you're trying to do," I said quietly. "The question is whether you know." I walked to the front door while they sat in their expensive dining room, probably trying to determine whether their evening had been a success or a failure. Outside, the air felt cleaner. My Honda started on the first turn, reliable as sunrise, and I drove home through suburbs that grew progressively less manicured, less perfect, less concerned with appearances. My house looked smaller than David's, older, showing its age in ways that 40 years of honest living will do to a place. But when I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, it welcomed me with the kind of familiarity that can't be purchased or designed. Margaret's reading glasses still sat on the kitchen counter, where she'd left them the morning of her stroke. I'd moved them a dozen times over the past 3 years, then put them back, because some things shouldn't be disturbed. I opened the bottle of Macallan and poured 2 fingers into a glass I'd inherited from my father. The whiskey was smooth, complex, probably worth every penny David had paid for it, but it tasted like goodbye, like the end of something I wasn't ready to finish. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I called a lawyer. Marcus Henley had been my attorney for 25 years, handling everything from property transfers to Margaret's will. His office still smelled of leather-bound books and old coffee, reassuring in its permanence. Unlike David's house, everything here served a purpose rather than making a statement. "Thomas," Marcus stood as I entered, extending his hand with the genuine warmth I'd forgotten existed. "Good to see you. Coffee?" I accepted the cup he offered, noting how he poured from a pot that had seen better decades rather than an expensive machine. "I need to understand my position, Marcus. Legally speaking." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "Has someone suggested you don't have one?" I told him about the dinner, the conversation, the careful way my family had presented their case for why my life needed restructuring. Marcus listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. "They can't force you to sell," he said finally. "Properties in your name, paid for, no liens. They can express opinions, but that's all they are." "What if they try to declare me incompetent?" Marcus leaned back, studying me over his reading glasses. "Thomas, you drove here. You're explaining a complex situation clearly, and you're thinking 3 moves ahead. Any doctor who declared you incompetent would be committing malpractice." But even as he said it, I could see the calculation in his eyes. We both knew that legal competence and family pressure were different battlefields entirely. "I want you to review everything," I said, My will, the property deeds, power of attorney documents. Make sure there are no vulnerabilities. Smart move, though I have to ask, are you considering their suggestion? I thought of Margaret's garden, still blooming 3 years after her death. The workshop where I'd built David's first bike, his first bookshelf, the jewelry box I'd crafted for Margaret's 50th birthday, the living room where we'd watched our son take his first steps, graduate high school, announce his engagement. No, I said, I'm not. The drive home took me past Miller's Hardware, where I had bought supplies for countless projects over the years. On impulse, I pulled in. Joe Miller looked up from his inventory sheets, his weathered face creasing into a smile. Tom Hartwell, haven't seen you in a month. How's retirement treating you? Can't complain. Listen, Joe, I need some security equipment. Motion sensors, maybe some cameras. His expression grew curious, but not judgmental. Everything all right? Just being cautious. I left with a bag full of wireless security devices and the feeling that Joe Miller, who'd never graduated high school but could fix anything with moving parts, understood loyalty better than my son ever would. That evening, as I installed the first camera overlooking my driveway, my phone rang. David's number. Dad, about last night, we may have come on too strong. I secured the camera bracket before answering. You came on exactly as strong as you intended. That's not fair. We're concerned about you. Are you, or are you concerned about property values and investment opportunities? Silence stretched between us. When David finally spoke, his voice carried a note I recognized from his childhood, the tone he used when caught in a lie but not ready to admit it. Can we try again? Just you and me this time. No Catherine, no her parents. Just father and son. Despite everything, hope flickered in my chest. Maybe this was David finally ready to have the conversation we should have had years ago. All right, I said, but not at your house. Meet me at Rossetti's tomorrow at 6. Rossetti's was the Italian place where Margaret and I had celebrated our anniversaries for 15 years. Nothing fancy, but the food was honest, and the owner, Sal, still asked about regulars by name. If David and I were going to talk, it should be somewhere that remembered who we used to be. Don't forget to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever found yourself caught between family loyalty and standing your ground? Your experiences help other fathers and families navigate these difficult situations. I arrived first, choosing a corner booth where we could talk without being overheard. Sal brought me coffee without being asked. The cup chipped at the handle, but filled with the kind of coffee that didn't need explaining. David walked in 10 minutes later, looking uncomfortable in casual clothes that probably cost more than Sal made in a week. He slid into the booth across from me, his movements careful, calculated. Thanks for agreeing to this, he said. Thank you for coming alone. We ordered. The lasagna for him, chicken parmigiana for me, the same meals we'd shared here when he was in high school, and we still had things to talk about. But the familiarity of the setting only highlighted how much had changed between us. Dad, I want you to know that everything we discussed last night, it comes from a place of caring. I cut my chicken with more attention than it required. Does it? Of course it does. You're my father. I used to think that meant something different than it apparently does now. David flinched as if I'd struck him. That's not fair. Isn't it? When's the last time you called just to see how I was doing? Not to update me on Catherine's promotion or your latest home improvement project, but to ask how I'm sleeping, what I'm reading, whether I miss your mother as much at breakfast as I do at dinner. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. No answer came. When's the last time you visited without wanting something? When's the last time you looked at a photograph of your mother and told me what you remembered about her? We're not good at that kind of talk, he said finally. We used to be. The silence that followed was heavy with 3 years of distance, 3 years of conversations we hadn't had and feelings we hadn't shared. David picked at his lasagna while I remembered the boy who'd sat in this same restaurant and told me about his first girlfriend, his college fears, his dreams of becoming an architect. The house really is too big for you, he said eventually. According to whom? According to logic? According to practicality? According to Catherine and her parents? His jaw tightened. Catherine has nothing to do with this. Doesn't she? Because from where I sat last night, it seemed like Catherine and her parents had quite a lot to do with this. You don't know Catherine like I do. I know she's never once asked about your mother. I know she's never shown any interest in family photographs or stories about your childhood. I know she introduced herself as David's wife at Margaret's funeral instead of your daughter-in-law. She was grieving too. Was she? Because grief usually involves some connection to what's been lost. David set down his fork, his face flushing with anger or embarrassment. You've never given her a chance. I've given her 12 years of chances. She's the one who's never bothered to take them. The accusation hung between us like smoke. David stared at his half-eaten meal while I wondered when we'd cross the line from father and son to adversaries. The property taxes alone are eating up your pension, he said, trying a different angle. My finances are my concern. Not if they become my concern when you can't manage them anymore. There it was, the assumption that my life was inevitably headed toward dependence, that my future was automatically his burden to bear, as if turning 73 was the same as becoming incompetent. I've never asked you for financial help, David, not once in your entire adult life. But you might need to, and if I do, that's my problem to solve. It doesn't work that way, Dad. Family doesn't work that way. I looked at my son, really looked at him, searching for some trace of the boy who'd helped me rebuild our back deck, who'd held my hand at his mother's bedside, who'd once told me I was the strongest man he knew. You're right, I said quietly. Family doesn't work that way. Family involves love, respect, and consideration for each other's feelings. What happened last night wasn't family. It was a business meeting disguised as concern. David's face went pale. That's not how it was meant. But that's how it was. You and your wife and her parents sat around my dining room table and discussed my life as if I weren't there, as if my feelings and my memories and my 40 years in that house didn't matter compared to your investment opportunities. It's not about money, isn't it? Then explain to me why Catherine's parents were there. Explain to me why the conversation focused on property values and market opportunities. Explain to me why you couldn't have this conversation with me privately before involving people who barely know me. He had no answer because there was no good answer. We both knew what last night had been about, and it wasn't my welfare. I'm going to ask you something, I said, and I want you to think before you answer. When you look at me, do you see your father, or do you see an obstacle to something you want? The question landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples across his expression. For a moment, I saw something that might have been shame, or recognition, or the ghost of the boy he used to be. I see my father, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Good, because when I look at you, I still see my son. Despite everything that's happened, despite last night, despite the fact that you've let your wife and her parents convince you that my life needs their management. I stood, pulling out my wallet. But I also see a man who's forgotten something important. Respect isn't something you outgrow just because you become successful. Dad, wait. I love you, David. I will always love you, but I won't be managed by you or anyone else. I left money on the table for both our meals and walked out into the evening air, which felt cleaner than the atmosphere inside. David didn't follow me. The drive home was quiet, the kind of silence that follows difficult truths. My house looked smaller in the darkness, older, but it welcomed me with the authenticity that David's mansion lacked. Inside, Margaret's reading glasses still waited on the kitchen counter, and her favorite coffee mug still hung on its hook. I made myself a sandwich and ate it standing at the counter, looking out at the yard where Margaret had planted her roses, where David had played catch with friends, where we'd hosted barbecues and birthday parties, and the quiet celebrations of ordinary life. Tomorrow, I would continue installing the security system. Tomorrow, I would call Marcus and make sure all my legal documents reflected my wishes rather than my family's assumptions. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of protecting what I'd built from people who saw it only as an asset to be liquidated. But tonight, I allowed myself to grieve not just for Margaret, but for the son I'd thought I had and the relationship I'd thought we shared. Some losses take years to fully understand, and this was one of them. The phone rang as I was turning off the lights, David's number again. I let it go to voicemail, but curiosity made me listen to the message. Dad, I think we need to talk some more. There are things you don't understand about our situation, financial pressures you don't know about. Please call me back. Financial pressures. So it was about money after all, just not in the way I'd initially understood. David wasn't just interested in my property as an investment opportunity. He needed it. I erased the message without calling back. Whatever pressures David was facing, they weren't my responsibility to solve, and they certainly didn't justify trying to manage me out of my own home. Some lessons, I was beginning to realize, could only be learned the hard way, and some boundaries could only be established by people willing to defend them. I didn't sleep well that night, not because of David's voicemail — I'd stopped losing sleep over his problems years ago — but because of what his admission revealed: financial pressures. The phrase echoed in my mind as I lay in the bed I'd shared with Margaret for 30 years, staring at the ceiling that needed painting and listening to the house settle around me. By morning, I'd made a decision. If David was in financial trouble, I needed to understand the scope of it, not to solve it, but to protect myself from it. I called my bank first thing, speaking to Sandra Morrison, who'd handled my accounts for 15 years. I need to understand my financial position completely, I told her. Assets, vulnerabilities, anything someone might use against me. Is there a specific concern, Mr. Hartwell? Family complications. Sandra's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who'd seen too many family disputes play out through banking records. I can have a complete portfolio analysis ready by this afternoon. Next, I called an old friend. Jim Patterson had worked in real estate appraisal for 40 years before retiring, and he owed me a favor from when I'd helped him rebuild his deck after the storm 2 summers ago. Jim, I need you to do something quietly. My property on Maple Street, I need to know exactly what it's worth in today's market. Getting ready to sell? Getting ready to understand what other people might think it's worth. He promised to drive by that afternoon, take measurements, check comparable sales. You'll have a number by tomorrow morning. The security system installation took most of the day. I positioned cameras to cover the driveway, front door, and backyard. Motion sensors went on every window and door. By evening, my modest house had better security than some banks. As I tested the system, my phone rang. Not David this time, but Catherine. Thomas, I hope you don't mind me calling directly. I minded, but politeness ran deeper than annoyance. What can I do for you, Catherine? I wanted to apologize for last night. I think we overwhelmed you, and that wasn't our intention. Her voice carried the practiced sincerity she used in her charity work, the tone that suggested concern while maintaining careful distance. I'd heard it enough times to recognize its calculated nature. What was your intention? To help, to support you during this difficult transition. What transition is that? A pause. I could almost hear her recalibrating. The transition to a simpler life, one with fewer responsibilities. Catherine, I'm going to save us both some time. I know what you want, and I know why you want it. The question is whether you're going to be honest about it or continue pretending this is about my welfare. Another pause, longer this time. When she spoke again, the practiced warmth had cooled several degrees. I don't know what David's told you. David's told me very little, but your father's comments about investment opportunities were quite illuminating. You don't understand the pressures we're under. There it was again. Pressure, need, the assumption that their problems automatically became my responsibility. Then explain them to me. David's firm is going through difficulties. There have been some setbacks, some projects that didn't pan out as expected. We've had to make some financial adjustments. Financial adjustments. In Catherine's vocabulary, that probably meant giving up the housekeeper or delaying the kitchen renovation, but the way she said it suggested something more serious. I'd love to hear from viewers about this. Have you ever dealt with adult children who expected you to solve their financial problems? Drop a comment and let me know how you handled it. Your experiences could help other parents facing similar situations. And you think my house represents a solution to your adjustments. We think it represents an opportunity for everyone to improve their situation. The careful phrasing revealed everything. Not David's opportunity, not my opportunity, but everyone's opportunity. As if my home was some kind of family asset, rather than the place where I'd built my life. Catherine, I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to listen carefully. My house is not for sale, my property is not available for your financial adjustments, and my life is not subject to your family's planning. Thomas, furthermore, if you or David or your parents continue to pressure me about this, I'll take steps to protect myself. Legal steps. The silence that followed was sharp, brittle. When Catherine spoke again, her voice had shed all pretense of warmth. I think you're making a mistake. We're trying to help you, and you're treating us like enemies. I'm treating you like people who are trying to take something that isn't theirs. It's not taking if it's for your own good. According to whom? You, your parents, people who see me twice a year and think that qualifies them to reorganize my life? According to people who love you. The word love hung in the air like a lie told so often it almost sounded true. But love didn't sit around dinner tables plotting to displace people from their homes. Love didn't recruit in-laws to pressure elderly widowers into life changes they didn't want. Catherine, I said quietly, if this is your idea of love, I'll take my chances with indifference. I hung up before she could respond. The next morning, Jim Patterson called with my property evaluation. The number was larger than I'd expected. Apparently, my modest neighborhood had become desirable to young families seeking affordable housing, large enough to solve significant financial problems, large enough to make my property very attractive to people facing pressure. Sandra's banking analysis arrived by email an hour later. My financial position was solid: pension, Social Security, savings accumulated over 40 years of careful living. Nothing extravagant, but more than adequate for my needs. More importantly, everything was in my name alone. No joint accounts, no co-signers, no legal vulnerabilities that family members could exploit. I was studying the documents when my doorbell rang. Through the new security monitor, I could see David standing on my porch, alone this time, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. I opened the door, but didn't invite him in. Dad, we need to talk. I thought we did that yesterday. Not about what we talked about what we didn't talk about. He looked older in the afternoon light, worn down by whatever pressures Catherine had hinted at. For a moment, I saw the boy who had come to me with scraped knees and hurt feelings, looking for someone to make things better. All right, I said, stepping aside. Come in. We sat in the living room, where he'd opened Christmas presents and played board games and done homework at the coffee table that still bore ring stains from countless cups of cocoa. But the familiarity of the setting couldn't bridge the distance that had grown between us. I'm in trouble, Dad. The admission came out in a rush, as if saying it quickly might make it less true. David stared at his hands while he talked, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had run out of options. The architectural firm. We took on some projects that were bigger than we could handle. Construction loans that went bad when the housing market shifted. I personally guaranteed some of the debt, thinking it would help us secure better terms. I listened without interrupting, watching my son confess to mistakes that would have been avoided with the kind of caution I had tried to teach him as a child. How much? I asked when he finished. Total exposure? Close to $800,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. I'd known David was struggling, but I hadn't imagined the scope of it. $800,000, more than I'd earned in the last 10 years combined. Insurance? Doesn't cover this kind of situation. The business is probably finished, Dad. And if I can't meet the personal guarantees, we could lose everything. The house, Catherine's car, all of it. He looked up at me with eyes that held the same desperate hope I'd seen when he was 8 years old and had broken Margaret's favorite lamp. The equity in your house, it's not enough to solve everything, but it would buy us time. Let us restructure, maybe save the business. There it was, finally. Not concern for my welfare or desire to help me transition to a simpler life. Just need, raw and honest and completely focused on what I could provide rather than what I might want. David, I said carefully, what makes you think I should risk my security for your business mistakes? Because you're my father. The simplicity of his answer was breathtaking, as if 45 years of my life, 40 years of marriage to his mother, 30 years of building equity in our home, all of it existed for the sole purpose of bailing him out when his own decisions went wrong. And what happens if I give you this money and your business fails anyway? What happens to my security then? It won't fail. We just need time. That's not what I asked. He didn't answer because we both knew the answer. I would be 73 years old, homeless, and broke. But he would have had his chance to save his business, which apparently mattered more than my future. I can't do it, David. The words came out quietly, but they landed like a gavel falling. David's face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, anger, and finally something cold and calculating that reminded me of Catherine. You won't do it, he corrected. I can't do it. There's a difference. You have the money, you have the equity, You could help us, but you're choosing not to. I'm choosing to protect my own future rather than subsidize your mistakes. They're not mistakes. They're business reversals, things that could happen to anyone. Could they? Because the David I raised understood the difference between calculated risks and reckless gambles. The David I raised wouldn't have bet his family's security on projects he couldn't afford to finish. His face flushed with anger. The David you raised didn't have to compete in today's market, didn't have to deal with economic pressures you can't understand. No, he just had to deal with a father who worked 60 hours a week to make sure he had college funds and a mother who took on extra shifts to pay for his architectural supplies. But I suppose that kind of pressure is different from the kind you're facing now. That's not fair. Isn't it? Margaret and I sacrificed for 20 years to give you opportunities. We drove old cars and delayed vacations and wore clothes until they fell apart so you could have what you needed. And now you sit in my living room and tell me that my refusal to sacrifice my home for your business ventures makes me selfish. The silence that followed was heavy with 3 decades of unspoken expectations and disappointments. David stared at the coffee table while I wondered when gratitude had been replaced by entitlement. "What am I supposed to do?" he asked finally. "What every adult does when they make bad decisions, face the consequences and figure out how to rebuild. Easy to say when it's not your life falling apart. My life did fall apart, David. 3 years ago when your mother died and I had to learn how to live without the person who had been my partner for 45 years, but I didn't expect you to fix that for me." He looked up sharply, something flickering in his eyes that might have been shame. "I didn't ask for your help then, because that's what adults do. They handle their own problems. They don't manipulate family members into solving them. Is that what you think I'm doing, manipulating you? What would you call last night's dinner? What would you call bringing Catherine's parents to pressure me? What would you call your wife's phone call yesterday?" No answer. Because there wasn't a good answer. "David, I love you. I will always love you. But I won't be managed, manipulated, or guilt-tripped into making decisions that aren't in my best interest." "So that's it? You'll let us lose everything rather than help?" "I'll let you face the consequences of your own choices rather than make them my responsibility." He stood abruptly, his face hard with an anger I hadn't seen since his teenage years. "You're a selfish old man." The insult should have hurt more than it did. Instead, it clarified something I had been struggling to understand. This wasn't my son speaking. This was a desperate man lashing out at anyone who wouldn't solve his problems. "Maybe I am," I said. "But I'm a selfish old man who still has a roof over his head." He headed for the door, then stopped, his hand on the knob. "This isn't over." "Yes, it is." After he left, I sat in my chair for a long time, listening to the house breathe around me. The security cameras showed him driving away too fast, his car disappearing around the corner in a spray of gravel. I thought about the boy who'd helped me plant Margaret's roses, who'd cried when his first goldfish died, who'd hugged me tight after his high school graduation and whispered "thank you" in my ear. That boy was gone, replaced by a man who saw his father as a financial resource rather than a person with feelings and needs and dreams of his own. But I also thought about Margaret, about the woman who'd taught me that love sometimes meant saying no, that helping people sometimes meant letting them fail, that the greatest gift you could give someone was the chance to discover their own strength. "I think you'd approve," I said to her photograph. The evening light was fading when I made my final decision. Tomorrow, I would call Marcus and make some changes to my will. Not out of spite, but out of clarity. David had shown me exactly what he thought I was worth, and it wasn't my job to prove him wrong. Some lessons I was learning could only be taught through consequences, and some relationships could only be saved by refusing to enable their destruction. The phone didn't ring that night, and for the first time in months, I slept soundly. The morning after David's confession, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. Not the bitter clarity of anger, but the steady focus that comes when you finally understand the game being played around you. I made my coffee, 1 cup, like always, and sat at the kitchen table with Margaret's photograph propped against the sugar bowl. Her smile seemed different today, more knowing, as if she'd been waiting for me to catch up to something she'd understood all along. $800,000, I said to her image. Can you believe it? The number still felt surreal. In my 40 years of work, I'd never seen that much money in one place. It represented more than my house was worth, more than my entire life savings, more than I could comprehend risking on anything, let alone someone else's business venture. But it explains so much. David's distance over the past year, Catherine's sudden interest in my welfare, the carefully orchestrated dinner with her parents, the whiskey that sat unopened on my counter like an expensive apology for what was coming. My phone rang at 9 o'clock sharp, Marcus Henley's office number. "Thomas, I've reviewed your documents like you asked. Everything's in order, but I want to discuss some additional protections." "What kind of protections?" "The kind that prevent family members from making decisions on your behalf without your explicit consent. Medical power of attorney, financial power of attorney, even something called a living will that specifies your wishes about medical care." The conversation that followed was sobering. Marcus explained how adult children could petition courts to declare elderly parents incompetent, how financial pressure could be applied through medical decisions, how property could be transferred through manipulation disguised as care. "I'm not saying your son would do these things," Marcus said carefully, "but desperate people sometimes make choices they wouldn't normally consider." By the time I hung up, I had appointments scheduled for the following week to sign documents that would protect me from the people who claimed to love me most. The irony wasn't lost on me. That afternoon, I decided to take a drive, not anywhere specific, just out of the house and away from the weight of recent revelations. I found myself heading toward the lake where Margaret and I used to picnic in the early years of our marriage, before David was born, when we were still discovering each other and dreaming about the family we'd build together. The lake looked smaller than I remembered, shrunken by development and drought. But the bench where we used to sit was still there, weathered but solid. I sat down and tried to remember what we'd talked about during those long afternoons, what dreams we'd shared, what fears we'd confessed. One conversation came back with startling clarity. We'd been discussing children, we were trying to get pregnant but hadn't succeeded yet, and Margaret had worried aloud about spoiling our future kids. "My parents gave me everything I wanted," she'd said. "And it took me years to learn that getting everything you want isn't the same as earning what you need. We'll teach them to work for things," I'd promised. "We'll make sure they understand the difference between wants and needs." Now, 30 years later, I wondered where we'd gone wrong. When had David stopped understanding that difference? When had he started seeing his parents as sources of solutions, rather than people deserving of respect? My phone buzzed with a text message. "Catherine. Thomas, I hope you'll reconsider. David is struggling more than he's let on. This situation could destroy our marriage." I stared at the message for a long time before responding. "Your marriage is between you and David. It's not my responsibility to preserve it." Her reply came quickly. "Family helps family." That's what Margaret would have wanted. The invocation of my dead wife's name hit me like a physical blow. Using Margaret's memory to manipulate me was a line I hadn't expected Catherine to cross, but it revealed the depth of their desperation. I called Marcus from the lake. "They're invoking Margaret's memory now," I told him, using her name to pressure me. "Document everything," he said immediately. "Screenshot the messages, keep records of every conversation. If this escalates to legal challenges, we'll need evidence of coercion." Will it escalate? $800,000 is a lot of motivation, Thomas. People have done worse things for less money. I know many of you watching have dealt with family financial pressure. Drop a comment about how you handled it. Sometimes sharing these experiences helps other families avoid the same pitfalls. That evening, I sat in my workshop for the first time in weeks. The familiar smell of wood shavings and oil helped calm my mind, and I found myself running my hands over the workbench I'd built 30 years ago. Every tool had its place. Every project had been completed with patience and precision. I'd taught David to use these tools when he was 12, showed him how to measure twice and cut once, how to respect the wood and let it guide the design. He'd been good at it, patient in a way that surprised me, careful with the details that separated craftsmanship from mere construction. But somewhere along the way, he'd stopped building things to last and started looking for shortcuts. The workshop door opened behind me. I turned, expecting to see a neighbor or delivery person, but it was David. He stood in the doorway like he was unsure whether he was welcome, his face carrying the exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept. "I used to love this place," he said quietly. "You're welcome here any time. You know that." He stepped inside, running his fingers along the same workbench where I'd been standing. "Remember when we built that birdhouse for Mom's birthday? You were 13, insisted on doing all the measurements yourself. And you let me, even though I screwed up the angles and the roof never sat right. It kept the rain out. That's what mattered." We stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, surrounded by the tools and memories of simpler times. For a moment, it felt like we might bridge the gap that had opened between us. "Dad, about yesterday, don't apologize for being honest," I said. "It's the first honest conversation we've had in years. I meant what I said about being in trouble, but I shouldn't have assumed. I shouldn't have expected. You shouldn't have manipulated me. There's a difference between asking for help and orchestrating an intervention." He nodded, looking younger than his 45 years. "Catherine's parents suggested the dinner approach. They said it would be less confrontational than just asking directly." "Catherine's parents barely know me, David. Why are they making suggestions about how to handle our relationship?" "Because I was desperate. Because I didn't know how to tell my father that I'd failed at the one thing I was supposed to be good at." The admission was raw, honest, and it broke something loose in my chest. This was my son again, not the stranger who had been demanding solutions to problems he'd created. "Failure isn't permanent," I said, "but the way you handle failure says everything about who you are. Easy to say when you've never failed at anything. Is that what you think? That my life has been one long success story?" David looked at me with genuine surprise. "Hasn't it been?" I thought about the business ventures that had fallen through, the projects that had gone over budget, the years when Margaret and I had struggled to pay bills and keep food on the table. The miscarriages before David was born, the nights I'd lain awake wondering if I was good enough at anything to support a family. "I lost 3 jobs before I was 30, I told him. "Got fired from 2 of them for being too stubborn to follow instructions I thought were wrong. Your mother and I went 6 months eating nothing but rice and beans because I was too proud to ask for help." David's eyes widened. "I never knew that. Because by the time you were old enough to understand, we'd figured things out. But there were plenty of years when we didn't know if we'd make it. What changed?" "We stopped looking for shortcuts, started building things that would last instead of things that would sell quickly, started measuring twice and cutting once, just like I taught you in this workshop." David was quiet for a long time, absorbing this revelation about parents he'd apparently seen as somehow immune to the struggles that defined adult life. "Is it too late?" he asked finally. "For what?" "To build something that lasts. To do this right." I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw something I'd missed during yesterday's confrontation. Beneath the desperation and demands was someone who genuinely wanted to change, who was tired of taking shortcuts and ready to do the hard work of rebuilding. "It's never too late," I said, "but it starts with accepting responsibility for where you are instead of looking for someone else to fix it. And if I can't save the business, then you figure out what comes next. People have survived worse things than business failures, David. Your great-grandfather lost his farm during the Depression and started over at 45, built a new life from nothing because he didn't have a choice. I don't know if I'm that strong. Strength isn't something you're born with. It's something you build, one decision at a time." We talked for another hour, really talked, in a way we hadn't since before Margaret died. David told me about the pressure he'd felt to maintain appearances, about Catherine's family's expectations, about the way success had isolated him from the values we'd tried to teach him. I told him about the fear I'd lived with since Margaret died, the worry that I'd become a burden, the loneliness that came with watching your only child drift away when you needed him most. When he finally left, we hugged. A real hug, not the careful embrace of strangers. And for the first time in months, I felt like I had my son back. But as I watched him drive away, I also knew that good intentions and honest conversations weren't enough to solve $800,000 worth of problems. David might want to change, but Catherine and her parents had invested too much in their original plan to give up easily. The real test was still coming. That night, I called Marcus one more time. "Set up those legal protections," I told him. "All of them. And Marcus, add something else to my will." "What's that?" "A scholarship fund. Something for kids who want to learn trades, who understand the value of building things with their hands. Fund it with whatever would have gone to David if he'd remained the son I thought I raised." "Thomas, are you sure? That's a permanent decision." "So is betrayal," I said. "I'm just making sure mine has better consequences than his did." As I hung up, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not the peace of surrender, but the peace that comes from finally understanding your position and preparing to defend it. The storm was coming, but I was no longer afraid of it. I was ready. Underscore, 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 underscore. To be continued in Part 5. Retry am viet tiep chatoifen 5. Edit Part 5. The breaking point. 3 days passed in deceptive calm. David didn't call, Catherine didn't text, and I began to hope that our conversation in the workshop had shifted something fundamental. Maybe honesty had been enough. Maybe the threat of legal boundaries had convinced them to find another solution. I should have known better. The first sign came on Thursday morning when I noticed a strange car parked across from my house. Silver sedan, tinted windows, someone sitting behind the wheel with what looked like paperwork. I watched from my kitchen window as the driver occasionally lifted binoculars in my direction. By afternoon, the car was gone, but I'd activated my security system's recording function. If someone was watching me, I wanted documentation. Friday brought a knock at my door. A woman in her 40s, professionally dressed, carrying a clipboard and wearing the kind of sympathetic expression usually reserved for funeral directors. "Mr. Hartwell, my name is Linda Carter. I'm with Adult Protective Services." The words hit me like cold water. Adult Protective Services? "We've received a report expressing concern about your welfare. I'm here to conduct a wellness check." I kept the chain lock engaged while I processed this development. Someone had reported me to social services. Someone who thought I needed protection from myself. "What kind of concerns?" I asked through the crack in the door. "The report suggests you may be isolated, depressed, possibly not maintaining proper nutrition or medical care. Standard procedure is a brief home visit to assess the situation. And if I refuse?" "That's your right, sir, but refusal often raises additional concerns." The threat was polite but unmistakable. I could refuse and look guilty, or submit to inspection and hope for the best. Either way, someone had just weaponized the social services system against me. I opened the door. Linda Carter's assessment took 30 minutes. She inspected my kitchen for signs of adequate food storage, checked my bathroom for medication compliance, asked about my social contacts and daily activities. Her questions were professional but invasive, the kind that reduced a lifetime of independence to checkboxes on a form. "Your home appears well-maintained," she concluded, making notes on her clipboard. "You seem alert and oriented. Do you have family nearby?" "A son." "And he's supportive of your independence?" The irony of the question was breathtaking. "He's very interested in my living situation." She missed the sarcasm entirely. "That's good. Family involvement is important for seniors aging in place." After she left, I called Marcus immediately. "They reported me to Adult Protective Services," I told him. "Who's they?" "Take a guess." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "This escalates things considerably, Thomas. APS involvement can be used to support competency challenges. If they decide you need assistance, how much assistance before I lose control of my own decisions? Depends on what they recommend and how aggressive your family gets about implementing those recommendations." I spent the weekend documenting everything. Linda Carter's visit, the surveillance car, every phone call and text from David or Catherine. The folder of evidence grew thicker, a paper trail of manipulation disguised as concern. Monday morning brought the next phase. I was in my workshop, trying to find peace in familiar routines, when the doorbell rang. Through the security monitor, I saw a man in an expensive suit, carrying a briefcase and wearing the confident expression of someone accustomed to getting his way. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm Robert Morrison, Catherine's father. I wonder if we might have a conversation. If you've ever dealt with in-laws who overstepped boundaries during family crises, please share your experiences in the comments. These situations are more common than you might think, and your stories could help other families navigate similar challenges." I opened the door but didn't invite him in. Gerald Morrison, I'd forgotten his first name was Robert, looked like a man accustomed to corporate boardrooms and country club luncheons. Everything about him projected authority, from his manicured fingernails to his precisely knotted tie. I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced. Actually, I do mind. What can I do for you, Mr. Morrison? He smiled the practiced smile of someone who'd spent decades in sales. I think we got off on the wrong foot at dinner the other night. Catherine's quite upset about the misunderstanding. What misunderstanding is that? The impression that we're somehow trying to pressure you. Nothing could be further from the truth. I studied his face, noting the careful way he held his expression, the calculated sincerity that never quite reached his eyes. This was a man who had built a career on convincing people to do things they didn't initially want to do. Mr. Morrison, I'm going to save us both some time. I know what you want, I know why you want it, and I know you're not going to get it from me. His smile faltered slightly. I'm not sure what David's told you about our family's situation. David's told me about his situation. Your family's situation is none of my concern. But it should be. When families face challenges, everyone has to pull together. Your family is facing challenges, Mr. Morrison. My family is me, and I'm doing just fine. The pretense of friendliness began to crack. Thomas, may I call you Thomas? You're being unrealistic. David's in serious trouble, the kind of trouble that could destroy lives, marriages, futures. Then perhaps David should have thought about that before making the decisions that created the trouble. He made those decisions trying to build something for his family, for his future. Doesn't that count for anything? It counts for exactly what it accomplished, which, according to David, is $800,000 in debt. Morrison's face flushed. You're being remarkably selfish for someone whose son has always put family first. The accusation was so breathtakingly wrong that I almost laughed. When has David put family first? When he moved 3 states away after college? When he visits twice a year and calls on holidays? When he skipped his mother's birthday to attend a business conference? When he missed her last Christmas because Catherine's family had already made plans? He's a busy man. He's a man who forgot where he came from. And now that he needs something, suddenly family matters. Morrison abandoned his salesman's smile entirely. You're going to let your own son lose everything because of pride? I'm going to let my son face the consequences of his choices because that's what adults do. Even if those consequences destroy his marriage, if his marriage can't survive financial setbacks, it wasn't much of a marriage to begin with. The words hit Morrison like a physical blow. His face went rigid, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a coldness that revealed his true feelings. You're a bitter old man who's forgotten what loyalty means. And you're a man whose daughter married into debt, and now you're trying to make it my problem. We stared at each other across my front porch, 2 men who'd dispensed with pretense and arrived at honest dislike. This isn't over, Morrison said finally. Yes, it is. I closed the door and watched through the security monitor as he walked to his car, his movements sharp with barely controlled anger. This was a man unaccustomed to being denied, and his reaction told me everything I needed to know about what came next. They'd tried manipulation disguised as concern. They'd tried guilt disguised as family loyalty. They'd tried official intervention disguised as welfare checks. Now they'd try something else. That afternoon, I received a registered letter from a law firm I'd never heard of. Inside was a petition for guardianship, filed by David Hartwell on behalf of his father, Thomas Hartwell, citing concerns about mental competency, social isolation, and inability to manage financial affairs. The petition was supported by statements from Catherine Hartwell and Robert Morrison, detailing observed instances of confusion, poor judgment, and declining self-care. Linda Carter's APS report was referenced as evidence of potential neglect. They were trying to have me declared incompetent. I sat in my kitchen, reading the legal document that would strip away my independence, my autonomy, my right to make decisions about my own life. The petition painted a picture of a confused, isolated old man who couldn't be trusted to manage his own affairs. It was masterfully crafted fiction, supported by just enough distorted truth to seem plausible to a judge who didn't know me. But it was also a mistake, because in trying to take everything from me, they'd finally revealed exactly who they were and what they were willing to do. And that revelation had freed me to respond in kind. I called Marcus immediately. They filed for guardianship, I told him. I was afraid they might. Thomas, this is serious. If a judge grants this petition, what do I need to do? Fight it with everything we have. Medical evaluations, character witnesses, financial records. We need to prove you're completely competent and that this is nothing more than a money grab. How long do we have? The hearing is scheduled for 3 weeks from today. That's not much time to build a defense. After Marcus hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my kitchen, feeling the weight of what my family had done to me. Not just the legal challenge, but the betrayal it represented. They were willing to destroy my dignity, my independence, my basic human rights for money. But as I sat there, something else began to grow alongside my anger: determination. They'd made a fundamental error in judgment. They'd assumed that because I was 73 and widowed, I was helpless. They were about to learn otherwise. I picked up the phone and began making calls. To Dr. Patterson, who'd treated me for 15 years and could testify to my mental acuity. To Jim Patterson, who could document my property management skills. To Father McKenna, who had known me since David's confirmation and could speak to my character. To Sandra Morrison at the bank, who could provide records showing my financial competence. To neighbors, friends, fellow veterans. Everyone who could testify that Thomas Hartwell was a capable, independent man being victimized by greedy relatives. By midnight, I'd assembled a defense team that would make David and Catherine's lawyers wish they'd never filed their fraudulent petition. But more than that, I'd made a decision about the future. Win or lose in court, my relationship with David was over, not in anger, but in clarity. A man who would try to have his father declared incompetent for money wasn't a son worth having. The boy I'd raised was gone. In his place was a stranger willing to destroy me for financial gain. It was time to act accordingly. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of protecting everything I'd built from the people who claimed to love me. And I would do it with the same methodical precision I'd brought to every project in my workshop. Measure twice, cut once. But this time, I was cutting ties that would never be repaired. The next morning, I stood in my workshop at 5:30, coffee steaming in the cold air, studying the tools I'd accumulated over 40 years of building. Each one had a purpose, a specific function that couldn't be replaced by good intentions or half measures. Today, I needed the right tool for the job ahead. I'd spent the night thinking about David's petition, about the lies packaged as legal documents, about the systematic campaign to strip away my independence. But I'd also been thinking about something else: the difference between defense and offense. Marcus wanted to fight their petition, to prove I was competent, to defend against their accusations. Noble work, necessary work, but ultimately reactive. They would control the narrative, and I would spend my energy disproving lies instead of establishing truth. There had to be a better way. By 7 o'clock, I was sitting in a different attorney's office. Not Marcus. He was family law, estate planning, the kind of careful work that built walls against future problems. I needed someone who specialized in tearing down walls that already existed. Janet Reeves had a reputation for aggressive litigation and creative solutions. Her office looked like a war room, with case files stacked like ammunition and law books opened to passages highlighted in yellow. She listened to my story without interruption, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. "So they want guardianship based on fictional incompetence," she said when I finished. "Classic elder abuse, dressed up in legal language. Can they succeed? Depends on the judge, but Thomas, here's the thing. Fighting their petition defensively might win, but it won't solve your real problem. Which is, they'll keep trying, different angles, different approaches, until they find something that sticks. You need to end this permanently." She explained the concept of a countersuit. Allegations of elder abuse, harassment, conspiracy to defraud. If we could prove their guardianship petition was fraudulent, filed with malicious intent to gain financial benefit, we could not only defeat their case, but destroy their credibility permanently. "It's aggressive," she warned, "and it means burning bridges that can never be rebuilt." I thought about David sitting in my workshop 3 days ago, talking about strength and second chances, while secretly preparing legal documents to have me declared incompetent. "The bridges are already burned," I said. "I just want to make sure they can't be crossed again." The next week was a blur of medical appointments and competency evaluations. Dr. Patterson ran every cognitive test he could think of, documenting my mental acuity with the thoroughness of a man who'd been personally offended by the suggestion that his patient was incompetent. 73 years old and sharper than most 30-year-olds. he told Janet during his deposition. If Thomas Hartwell is incompetent, then competence has lost all meaning. The financial evaluation was equally thorough. Sandra Morrison from the bank provided detailed records showing not just my solvency, but my careful management of investments and property over the past decade. My bills were current, my taxes filed on time, my financial decisions conservative and well-reasoned. Mr. Hartwell manages his finances better than most of my commercial clients, she testified. The suggestion that he needs a guardian is absurd, but the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source. Janet had hired a private investigator to document David and Catherine's activities during the weeks leading up to their guardianship petition. What he found was a pattern of coordination that suggested premeditation. Phone records showing dozens of calls between David, Catherine, and her parents in the 2 weeks before their dinner invitation. Email exchanges discussing strategies for convincing Dad to be reasonable and backup plans if he won't cooperate voluntarily. A paper trail that made their concern for my welfare look like what it really was, a coordinated campaign to seize my assets. Most damaging was a voicemail Catherine had left for her mother, apparently unaware that her phone was recording. If we can't convince him to sell voluntarily, the guardianship route gives us complete control. Once the court declares him incompetent, we can make whatever decisions are necessary. The recording was legally admissible and ethically devastating. I'm curious to hear from viewers who've dealt with family members who tried to manipulate legal systems for personal gain. How did you protect yourself? Your experiences could help other families recognize these warning signs before it's too late. By the time Janet finished building our case, David's guardianship petition looked like what it was, fraud disguised as family concern, but she'd also uncovered something else that explained the urgency behind their actions. David's financial situation was worse than he'd admitted. Court records from his business bankruptcy showed personal guarantees that went far beyond $800,000. He owed money to investors, contractors, suppliers, and at least one private lending company that specialized in high-risk loans to desperate borrowers. He's not just facing business failure, Janet explained. He's facing potential criminal charges for fraudulent representations to investors. The guardianship isn't just about getting your money, it's about avoiding prison. The revelation should have shocked me, but instead it brought a strange sense of relief. My son hadn't just made bad business decisions. He'd crossed lines that separated poor judgment from criminal behavior. This wasn't about family loyalty anymore. It was about legal consequences that no amount of fatherly love could prevent. 2 days before the guardianship hearing, David called me for the first time since our workshop conversation. Dad, we need to talk. I think we've said everything we need to say to each other. You don't understand how serious this is. The people I owe money to, they're not patient. If I can't make payments soon, things could get very bad. For whom? For all of us. They know where you live, Dad. They know about your house, your routine. If they think you're the reason I can't pay... The threat was delivered with the casual tone of someone mentioning the weather, but its implications were clear. David was suggesting that my refusal to help him could put me in physical danger from his creditors. Are you threatening me, David? I'm trying to protect you. If you'd just be reasonable about the house, reasonable like filing fraudulent guardianship papers behind my back? Silence. Then, how did I know that my own son was trying to have me declared incompetent? Because I'm not the confused old man you described in your petition. Dad, that wasn't my idea. Catherine's parents said it was the only way. The only way to what? Steal my property without my consent? To protect you from making decisions that could hurt all of us. The casual way he said it, as if my property was somehow communal, as if my independence was a threat to their welfare, revealed how completely he'd embraced their narrative. David, I said quietly, you're going to lose in court. You're going to lose badly. And when you do, everyone will know exactly what you tried to do to your father. You can't prove... I can prove everything. Phone records, email chains, financial documents, witness testimony. I even have Catherine on tape discussing how guardianship would give your family complete control over my decisions. The silence that followed was different from his previous pauses. This was the silence of someone realizing that their carefully constructed plan was collapsing. What do you want? He asked finally. I want you to withdraw the petition. I want you to leave me alone. and I want you to understand that whatever relationship we once had is over. Dad, please. You made your choice when you decided to have me declared incompetent. Now live with the consequences." I hung up before he could respond. The guardianship hearing was held in a sterile conference room that smelled of industrial carpet and broken dreams. David sat at one table with his attorney, looking pale and exhausted. Catherine and her parents flanked him like bodyguards, their expressions carefully composed but their eyes nervous. I sat with Janet at the opposing table, our evidence organized in neat stacks, our witnesses prepared to testify. The judge was a woman in her 50s, who'd apparently seen enough fraudulent guardianship petitions to recognize one immediately. David's attorney presented their case with the enthusiasm of someone performing a task he knew was hopeless. The evidence of my supposed incompetence was thin and contradictory. I lived alone, but maintained my property meticulously. I was socially isolated, but had regular contact with neighbors, doctors, and service providers. I made poor financial decisions, but had managed my money successfully for decades. When Janet began presenting our defense, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Medical records documenting my mental acuity, financial records proving my competence, witness testimony establishing my independence and capability. And then came the recordings. Catherine's voice filled the room, casual and calculating, as she discussed using guardianship to gain complete control over my decisions. The phone records showing their coordination, the email exchanges revealing their true motivations. By the time Janet finished, David's attorney was visibly uncomfortable, and David himself looked like he wanted to disappear. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. "Petition denied," she announced. Furthermore, this court finds clear evidence of fraudulent intent and elder abuse. I'm referring this matter to the district attorney for possible criminal prosecution. David's face went white. Catherine's parents exchanged panicked glances. Their attorney began frantically packing his briefcase, as if he could escape the implications of what had just happened. But I felt no satisfaction in their defeat, only sadness for the relationship that had died in this sterile room, killed by greed and desperation, and the kind of betrayal that couldn't be forgiven or forgotten. Outside the courthouse, David tried to approach me, but Janet stepped between us. "My client has no interest in speaking with you," she told him. "Any further contact will be considered harassment." As we walked away, I heard Catherine's voice, sharp with panic. "What do we do now? What happens next?" I didn't turn around to see David's response. I'd spent 45 years caring what happened to him next. That responsibility had ended the moment he'd signed his name to a petition declaring me incompetent. Some relationships, I was learning, could only be saved by ending them completely. The drive home was quiet, peaceful, in a way I hadn't felt in months. My house looked the same as always, but something fundamental had changed. It was no longer a prize to be contested or an asset to be liquidated. It was simply my home again, protected by law and defended by truth. That evening, I called Marcus to discuss some changes to my will. "Given recent events," I told him, "I think it's time to make my final wishes crystal clear." The conversation that followed was businesslike but satisfying. David's inheritance would be redirected to the scholarship fund I'd mentioned earlier. The house would go to a veterans organization that helped aging former servicemen maintain their independence. My savings would fund programs that protected elderly people from exactly the kind of abuse I'd just experienced. "You're sure about this?" Marcus asked. "These changes are permanent." "So is their betrayal," I said. "I'm just making sure mine has better consequences." As I hung up, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. For the first time since Margaret's death, my future was entirely my own. No one could take it, manipulate it, or declare it invalid. I was free. The house felt different in the days following the hearing. Not larger or smaller, but somehow more solid, as if the legal victory had reinforced its foundation. I moved through rooms that were unquestionably mine, past furniture that would now never be appraised by strangers, through a life that belonged entirely to me. It should have been liberating, and it was, mostly, but freedom, I was discovering, had its own weight. 3 days after the judge's ruling, I received a call from Detective Sarah Chen with the county prosecutor's office. They were moving forward with elder abuse charges against David, Catherine, and her parents. They needed my testimony, my cooperation in building a criminal case. And Mr. Hartwell, what they did to you, filing fraudulent guardianship papers, coordinating to declare you incompetent for financial gain, it's textbook elder abuse. We can't let it stand. I sat in my kitchen, coffee growing cold, thinking about David in handcuffs, Catherine in a courtroom facing criminal charges, the boy who had helped me build Margaret's garden fence, the young man who had called me crying after his first heartbreak. Detective Chen, I said finally, I appreciate your concern, but I think they've been punished enough. Sir, with respect, they tried to steal your independence. If we don't prosecute, they might try again with someone else. She was right, of course, but something in me recoiled at the idea of watching my son led away in chains, even after everything he'd done. Let me think about it, I said. That afternoon, as I worked in Margaret's garden, deadheading roses, pulling late-season weeds, I found myself remembering a conversation Margaret and I had years ago about forgiveness. David had been 16, caught lying about where he'd been on a Friday night, and I'd been ready to ground him for a month. Punishment should teach, not just hurt, Margaret had said, her hands gentle on soil that would soon bloom with her careful attention. The question isn't whether he deserves consequences. It's whether those consequences will help him become a better person. Now, 30 years later, I wondered what consequences would help David become a better person, or if it was already too late for that kind of transformation. My phone rang while I was washing soil from my hands. A number I didn't recognize, but the voice was familiar. Mr. Hartwell, this is Catherine. I almost hung up immediately. Then curiosity stayed my hand. What do you want, Catherine? I wanted to apologize for everything. The dinner, the pressure, the guardianship petition, all of it. Her voice carried none of its usual polish. She sounded tired, defeated, possibly even genuine. Apologies don't undo fraud, I said. I know, but I needed to say it anyway. You were right about us, about what we became. I let my parents convince me that... She stopped, seeming to collect herself. That's not an excuse. I'm not calling to make excuses. Then why are you calling? Because David is falling apart. The business is officially bankrupt. The criminal investigation is moving forward, and I'm filing for divorce. The last piece of information hit me harder than I expected. Whatever David's failures as a son, his marriage had been one of the few things in his life that seemed stable. I'm sorry to hear that. Are you? Really? I considered the question seriously. I'm sorry that David is losing his wife along with everything else. I'm not sorry that you're leaving someone who tried to defraud his own father. Silence stretched between us. When Catherine spoke again, her voice was smaller, more vulnerable than I'd ever heard it. He really did love you, you know, before everything went wrong. He used to talk about you all the time, the things you taught him, the way you and Margaret made marriage look easy. He wanted to be like you. He had a strange way of showing it. People do terrible things when they're desperate. That doesn't excuse it, but... She paused. I just thought you should know that before all this started, before the money problems and the pressure from my parents, he really did love you. After she hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, watching shadows lengthen across the floor. Catherine's words had reopened something I'd been trying to close. The question of who David really was beneath the desperation and poor choices. I know many of you have dealt with family members who made terrible decisions during financial crises. How do you separate the person from their actions? How do you hold on to love while protecting yourself? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. That evening, I called Detective Chen back. I've decided not to press charges, I told her. Sir, I have to advise against that decision. These people are my family, and families should handle their problems privately when possible. It wasn't entirely true. David had forfeited the right to be considered family when he'd tried to have me declared incompetent, but prosecuting him wouldn't undo the damage to our relationship, and it wouldn't protect other elderly people from similar schemes. It would just add more pain to a situation already overflowing with it. However, I continued, I want the case file to remain open. If they ever try something like this again, with me or anyone else, I want them prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Detective Chen wasn't happy with my decision, but she agreed to keep the file active as a deterrent. 2 weeks later, I received a letter forwarded through Marcus's office. David's handwriting, careful and formal, written on plain paper rather than his usual business letterhead. Dad, I know I have no right to write to you, and I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I need to say some things, even if you never respond. I was wrong, not just about the guardianship petition or the dinner or trying to pressure you about the house. I was wrong about who you are and what you meant to me. I let desperation turn me into someone I don't recognize, someone who could look at his father and see an obstacle instead of a person. Catherine is leaving me. The business is finished. I'll probably have to file personal bankruptcy and start over from nothing. But the worst part isn't losing the money or the house or even my wife. It's knowing that I lost my father because I forgot the most important thing you taught me. That character matters more than success. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even deserve it. But I want you to know that I remember who you really are. You're the man who worked double shifts to pay for my college, who sat with Mom in the hospital every day for 3 months, who taught me that building something worthwhile takes patience and integrity, and that shortcuts always cost more than you think they'll save. I'm sorry I forgot that. I'm sorry I became someone who could hurt you. And I'm sorry it took losing everything to remember that you were never the problem. I was. I hope you're happy in the house you built, surrounded by the memories you and Mom created together. You deserve peace, and I'm glad you found the strength to protect it from people like me. Your son, if you'll still let me call myself that, David. I read the letter 3 times, then set it on the kitchen table next to Margaret's photograph. Her smile seemed softer somehow, more knowing, as if she'd been waiting for this moment of honesty between her husband and her son. The letter didn't change anything legally. It didn't undo the betrayal or restore the trust that had been broken, but it did something else. It separated the man David had become from the boy I'd raised, acknowledging that somewhere beneath the desperation and poor choices, traces of that boy still existed. That night, I did something I hadn't done since Margaret's death. I wrote a letter of my own. David, I received your letter, and I appreciate the honesty in it. It takes courage to admit mistakes, especially ones with consequences as serious as these. You're right that I can't forgive what you did. Trust once broken in such a fundamental way can't be repaired with words or good intentions. But I can acknowledge that people are more complicated than their worst decisions, and that the boy I raised still exists somewhere inside the man who tried to betray me. I hope bankruptcy teaches you what success couldn't, that your worth isn't measured by what you own, but by how you treat the people who love you. I hope starting over gives you the chance to rebuild not just your finances, but your character. I won't be part of that rebuilding. That bridge was burned too thoroughly to repair, but I'll remember the good man you could be, and I'll hope that losing everything helps you find him again. Take care of yourself. Dad. I mailed the letter the next morning, then spent the day doing something I had been putting off for months. I went through Margaret's things. Not to dispose of them, I wasn't ready for that, but to organize them, to create some system for the memories that filled drawers and closets and boxes throughout the house. Her jewelry went into the safe with a list detailing which pieces came from which occasions. Her photographs were sorted chronologically and placed in acid-free storage boxes. Her books were arranged on shelves in the spare room, creating a library of her interests and passions. It was slow work, made slower by the memories each item evoked. A scarf she'd worn to David's graduation, a recipe card stained with ingredients from countless Sunday dinners, a love letter I'd written her during our first year of marriage, saved in a wooden box she'd kept on her dresser. By evening, I was exhausted, but also strangely peaceful. Margaret's presence in the house hadn't diminished. If anything, organizing her belongings had made her feel more present, more integrated into the fabric of daily life. As I sat on the porch watching the sunset, I realized something had shifted in my relationship with grief. For 3 years, I'd been haunted by loss, by the absence of the woman who'd been my partner in everything. But today, surrounded by the evidence of our life together, I'd felt something different. Gratitude. Gratitude for 45 years of marriage to someone who'd understood me completely. Gratitude for a son who, despite his failures, had given us years of pride and joy before things went wrong. Gratitude for a house that had sheltered 3 generations of love and laughter and ordinary happiness. Most of all, gratitude for the strength to protect what mattered when protection was needed. My phone buzzed with a text from Jim Patterson, the real estate appraiser who had become something of a friend over the past months. Tom, saw the news about the court case. Glad you came out on top. Coffee sometime this week?" I smiled as I typed back, "Thursday morning, Rosetti's, 9 a.m. My treat." It felt good to make plans that had nothing to do with legal battles or family drama. Plans that existed simply because two old men enjoyed each other's company and the luxury of time to share it. As darkness settled over the neighborhood, I went inside and locked the doors, a precaution that felt routine now rather than fearful. The security system activated with a soft chime, not because I expected trouble, but because protection had become a habit worth maintaining. In the kitchen, I poured myself a glass of water and stood at the sink, looking out at the yard where Margaret had planted her roses, where David had played as a child, where I had hosted barbecues and birthday parties, and the 1,000 small celebrations that made up a life well lived. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and opportunities. There would be decisions to make about the house, about my health as I aged, about how to spend whatever years remained. But tonight, for the first time since Margaret's death, I felt ready for those decisions. They would be mine to make, in my own time, according to my own judgment. No one could take that from me anymore. The house settled around me with familiar sounds, the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock on the mantel, the whisper of wind through trees Margaret had planted decades ago. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, peaceful, protected by the ordinary vigilance of people who'd chosen to build lives worth defending. I was one of them again, not a victim to be rescued or an asset to be managed, but simply a man in his own home, surrounded by memories that belonged entirely to him. It was enough, more than enough. It was exactly what Margaret would have wanted for me, and exactly what I'd fought to preserve. The weight of freedom, I'd discovered, was lighter than the weight of betrayal, and infinitely more precious than the weight of gold. I turned off the kitchen light and headed upstairs to bed, leaving Margaret's photograph on the counter where it could catch the first light of tomorrow's sunrise. She'd been my partner in building this life, and now she would be my companion in enjoying the peace that came from protecting it. Some battles, I'd learned, were worth fighting not for what you gained, but for what you refused to lose. This had been one of them.